Class, this lesson today is going to be on congruent figures. By the end, you should know and be able to identify corresponding parts of a geometric figure and know and be able to use the definition of congruence. Let's talk about congruent figures first of all. So if I have these red and blue pieces, I want to know which of these are actually congruent. So what I could do is I could take this piece, bring it over to this one. I'm actually going to flip it around a little bit and see congruence means it has to have the same size and shape. So that is, those two are definitely congruent pieces. What about this triangle? I could bring this over here. If I take it, well, we'll just turn this blue one around. If I turn that, are those the same size and shape? Yes, they are. So the triangles are congruent. And then we've got the trapezoid. Again, same size and shape. Those are congruent. What do you think about the arrow? I'm thinking for sure these are not going to be the same size. This red one looks to be quite a bit smaller than the blue. So those are not congruent. So I'm going to go ahead and take those out. Those are not congruent. Then we've got this long piece. I can turn this sideways. Those are the same size and shape, so those are congruent. How about the square? I'm going to have to turn this guy a little bit. Again, those are congruent. This pentagon, there is no way that that is congruent with this pentagon. Those are totally a different size. And then these triangles right here are definitely not congruent. Okay, because congruent means you need to have equal sides and equal angles. So those are definitely not congruent. Just these guys over here are the ones that are congruent. Definition of congruence. In congruent figures, all the parts of one figure are congruent to the corresponding parts of the other figure. So again, as I said before, all sides are equal and all angles are equal. That would make them congruent. So let's look at these two triangles. I want to, sorry, that's off center a little bit. I want to write a congruent statement and identify all pairs of congruent corresponding parts. So if I look at these, let's first write the congruent parts. Now, each of these lines that are here, okay, these mean that these are equal to each other. Okay, so these sides are corresponding. They are equal. So I could say that line segment JL is congruent, and this is how we write a congruent symbol. It's kind of like the top of the pie symbol and an equal sign underneath. That means congruent. So JL is congruent to TR, line segment TR. Notice I'm putting a line over those. That shows that that's a line segment. Okay, now we look for the one with the one line through it. Okay, so this one and this one, those are equal. So I could say that JK line segment is congruent to TS. And then likewise with this one that has the two lines through it, LK, line segment LK, is congruent to line segment RS. Okay, so the line segments are congruent. Now let's find the other corresponding parts. We can do the same thing with the angles. Again, we've got three lines in this angle, okay, and it's curved, showing that it's the angle part that they're saying is congruent. So what this means is that angle J is congruent to angle T. Okay, angle J is congruent to angle T. Now we'll go to the one with two, so angle R is congruent to angle L. And notice how I'm labeling the angle when I write this out with this little angle symbol. We talked about that a few weeks ago. Okay, last angles that are congruent, angle K is congruent to angle S. So we need to make sure that we say all of these congruent parts. Okay, so all of the sides have to be congruent, and all of the angles have to be congruent. So then when I write my congruence statement, that means we're putting the triangles together. Okay, so I'm going to say triangle. Now we need to make sure that we label this correctly. I'm going to go JKL. Triangle JKL is congruent to, notice I labeled with a triangle, and I've got JKL is congruent to triangle. Now we have to make sure that we name this correctly. Because this angle is the one that's congruent to angle T, we have to say the T first, okay? Because J and T are congruent, so they need to be in the same spot when we show congruence. Now K is the angle that has one line, so an S would have to be next, and then L corresponds to R, so R would have to be next, okay? So J corresponds to T, K corresponds to S, L corresponds to R, okay? And there are some other things that you can look at as well. Line segment JK is congruent to line segment TS. Line segment KL is congruent to line segment SR. And then you could take the two outer ones. JL is congruent to TR. And then again, these angles we already talked about, those would be congruent to each other as well. So that is how you label congruent statements and corresponding parts. Now we need to show that figures are congruent. Okay, so we've got this picture of this lady painting a wall. They're asking, is this orange section and blue section the same size and shape? Are they congruent? Now, underneath here I have an explanation, and it's kind of long, okay? But if we go through it, it will make sense in a moment. So it says, from the diagram, angle C and angle A are congruent, okay? Which makes sense because those are both right angles. D and B are also congruent because they are right angles. Also, by lines perpendicular to a transversal theorem, they're saying that AB is parallel to DC, okay? So let's think about that for a second. We have two parallel lines, pretend like those are parallel, okay? And they have a transversal going through them, okay? So say this is your transversal right here. So this is angle 1, this is angle 2, this is angle 3, this is angle 4. And there's something that you learned, or you should have learned, that these are called alternate interior angles. That's a big definition word, alternate interior angles theorem. Very important. What that's saying is that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. So I would go ahead and show that those are congruent by putting those angle markers in there. And it also says that angle 2 has to be congruent to angle 3. So notice I put two lines on those because those are congruent to each other. Okay? So all pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. We showed that the right angles are congruent, and we showed that 1 and 4 and 2 and 3 are congruent. Now it also shows that AJ is congruent to KC. KD, okay, this one is congruent to JB. And then we've got DA or AD is congruent to BC because those both have 3 lines. And then I think the one that I didn't state so far is JK, okay? Those are congruent because of the reflexive property. And basically what that means is because they are the same line, they have to be congruent with each other. Okay, so JK is congruent to KJ. So that means that this quadrilateral is congruent to this quadrilateral. If I were to name them, okay, and show the congruent statement, I would say oops, I need my pen back. Come here, pen. A, J, K, D is congruent to, now I got to make sure I get these corresponding, so it'd be C to K, okay, because those are the corresponding angles. And then since I did A, J, K, then this would be J here, and then A, J, K, D, then this would be B, because D and B are congruent. Okay, so this would be the congruent statement for this wall, the orange and the blue together. A little bit confusing, but it does actually work. So you could really just take those quadrilaterals and flip them around and they would be right on top of each other. The angles and the sides would all be congruent. Now let's use properties of congruent figures to solve for x and y. Okay, so they're saying that DEFG is congruent to SPQR. Knowing that, angle Q, if I look at where it sits, angle Q, where'd my pen go again? Angle Q is congruent to angle F, the way they're sitting in there. So if this is Q, then F is the one that's congruent to it. Okay, so that means that 68 degrees has to be equal to 6y plus x. Well, that's going to be pretty hard to solve the way it is right now because I don't know what y or x are. So next, let's find where the x is. So this is the line QR, okay? QR has to be congruent to GF. And if I look, QR corresponds with GF in the way that it's written up there with congruence. So that means that this 12 feet has to be equal to this 2x minus 4 feet. Now this I can solve for x. So I would add 4 to both sides. 16 equals 2x. And then we would divide both sides by 2. So the 2's factor out, x would be 8. Okay? Now, since x is measured in feet, I would say 8 feet. Don't forget the label. Okay, so there's one part of our answer. Now that I know what x is, I can go over here and plug that in. 68 equals 6y plus x is 8. Now to solve, I would subtract 8 first. So 60 equals 6y. And then we would divide both sides by 6. 60 divided by 6 is 10, equals y. Okay? And this is angle measurement, so this would be 10 degrees. Y is 10 degrees. Okay? So there is x and y. Now, if you could, please take the time and glue that part of the note sheet into your composition book. Also, this would be the time where you would start working on your worksheet. The worksheet is going to be a little bit tricky. You may have to look at a couple of answers for each section just to make sure that you're doing them correctly. Part of it is labeling the triangles with the angles and the congruent sides correctly. And part of it is just labeling which side is congruent with which side. Okay? So take some time, glue the first part of your note sheets into your notebook, and do the worksheet. Come back for part 2 in just a little bit.